us live. And thanks to our colleagues at the NAS for organizing this. I'm not used to being first with a last name that starts with an S. Usually I'm the closer, but I'm happy to launch. And I have the great privilege, I think, of sharing with you some of my own findings about the Great Society, but through the lens of a person who's not generally front and center when we talk about those programs. We talk about Lyndon Johnson, but we don't necessarily speak about the person I think of as the other LBJ, Ladybird Johnson. And I'll just share for a few minutes with you what I discovered in her as far as her own participation in shaping the Great Society programs of her husband's presidency. Let me say that, of course, there's considerable scholarship on LBJ, very limited amount of it, if really any, places Ladybird Johnson at the center of the story. But lo and behold, and that's for many reasons about, I would say, the gendered nature of presidential history and the proclivity to focus on the man in power. But lo and behold, it turns out there's a vast and no longer, but had been quite unexcavated range of source material about Ladybird herself. She was a journalism and a history major at the University of Texas in Austin. And she, for the entire stretch of her professional and partnership and marriage with Lyndon, kept very detailed records of their, what I call their joint enterprise, including 123 hours of audio tape that she recorded beginning the day of the assassination of John F. Kennedy in November of 1963, straight through the end of January of 1969. And what we hear in her voice and read in the transcripts of that material, when we put it together with all of the other archival sources that I was able to cull through in archives around the country, is how important she was to thinking through, strategizing, and shaping key aspects of her husband's presidency. And I know we're talking about Great Society specifically here, but it's broader than that. If we had to choose one area of policy that Ladybird is associated with, it would probably be something that people know in the vernacular called beautification, which is a word that was sort of invented to conceal her rather broad environmentalism. And the invitation to this program did mention the environmental components of LBJ's Great Society. And what I want to stress in the few moments that I'm going to speak is that in the early 1960s, the American public didn't really have an environmental consciousness in the way we think of that today. Ladybird Johnson's most important legacy as it relates to the Great Society is most certainly her role in building a public consciousness around the environment, around the fact of the impact of industrial processes on the natural environment, and on the necessity, as she saw it, for legal and regulatory constraints around that impact. She also had kind of in her bones, in her core, a very deep sense of the importance of connecting to nature, that men and women's humanity really requires access to nature in order to become fully human. And that goes back to her very early childhood. And I say that because Ladybird, we think of the highway beautification, the 1965 law that passed as her signature impact. But in fact, in a much more deep and far-reaching way, I'll say a little bit about why that was just really the beginning for her. When she came into the White House, she was coming on the heels of a period in post-war America, the 40s and 50s, where a great deal of federal dollars were spent on two signature infrastructure projects, one being the interstate highway system, the second being urban renewal programs. And so although we think of her as focused on beautifying highways because she drove up and down between Washington, D.C. and Texas all the time and, wanted a more aesthetic experience, what she was really part of in terms of the zeitgeist of the moment was a larger public debate about the impact on cities, the edges and entrances and exits of cities, and within cities on communities of color and the most underserviced parts of American cities of these major investments. Urban renewal had the effect of displacing hundreds of thousands of people around the country in American cities, many of them people of color. Similarly, highway construction in and out of the edges of cities did the same. So in the early 1960s, the kind of ornamental focus of her early beautification efforts evolved into an attempt with Washington, D.C. as the model and as the test case to bring together access to nature in American cities with civil rights. And Washington, D.C. for Ladybird becomes the context and the test case for her, because although she was Texan, she was also, for 30 years before entering the White House, a Washingtonian. Washington at the time was the largest majority Black city in the country, and she and LBJ had experienced directly and viscerally from being Southerners, but also because one does as a Washingtonian, I live and work in Washington today, understood the segregation, the geographic segregation within DC and the segregated distribution, uneven distribution of resources within the District of Columbia, which had no representation in the Congress, still barely does. So she, by 1968, had tried in terms of amplifying the White House's environmental agenda to focus on Washington, D.C. in partnership with a number of quite interesting landscape architects, philanthropists, activists, environmentalists, on showing how this is a time when big government was less critiqued than it is today, focusing on how to harness federal dollars toward desegregating access to nature, especially in American cities. I would say Ladybird's impact in doing that isn't fully understood still, because her contributions have been so concealed by the way in which her time in the White House has kind of been ignored or diminished by that euphemistic word, beautification, and also the extent to which the environmental agenda as a whole has not gotten nearly as much attention as the civil rights trajectory of the Johnson White House or the Vietnam trajectory of the Johnson White House. The last thing I'll say, and this is a generic note, is that she was, I think, the first post-World War II First Lady to really attempt, obviously in direct partnership with her husband, to link the political and policy agendas of the East Wing and the West Wing. She built a considerable staff. She had a major political operation. Her environmentalism was just a piece of it. She also worked very hard on civil rights in her own way, and also on other aspects of the Great Society, such as the arts component of it, and certainly education and health, those three. But to rank order the importance of her role, I would say that this environmentalism of the 1960s, which of course laid the groundwork for what we saw under Richard Nixon and subsequently with the creation of the EPA, for example, and other pretty vast regulatory environmental approaches that the public came to support because of her. That's really the finding that I found most surprising and revealing, not just about her, but about Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society program as a whole. I'm gonna stop with that. I'm used to speaking short,
okay.
So if I don't take my full 14 minutes, I'll take it up later.
All right, thank you. Sorry, I wanted to make sure I wasn't stepping on your final words.
No, you got it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So we're going to go to Professor Zarefsky now, if you'd be so kind.
I usually speak long, so I may take the time that you left. I'm delighted to appear on this program and to share this time and space with my colleagues. I'm very grateful to Professor Zweig for shedding light on the role of Ladybird Johnson. I would just say that it was ubiquitous across the administration. The most recent book that I did was on Johnson's speech of March 1968, in which he announced he would not run for re-election. And Ladybird's imprint, although quite subtle, is on that speech, for example. She was one of the people that regularly read all the 11 drafts leading up to the final copy, and she made some very savvy, nuanced suggestions, including, for example, that he said, "I will not accept," rather than "I would not accept," and she argued out why that difference mattered. And in a lot of ways, very subtle like that. She was quite influential, and I think her influence went across the administration. But I want to talk about the term the Great Society and suggest that the term itself is a source of some of the controversies that have attended it in the 60s and since the 60s. Simply put, it had no precise definition. And so for many people, the Great Society was a stereotype. Many political conservatives regarded it as throwing dollars after problems in the arrogant belief that no social evil is so intractable that it can't yield to federal attention and funds. For a lot of political liberals, the Great Society was a stereotype that was caricatured by Doris Kearns Goodwin as a cornucopia of programs ranging from Medicare for the old, educational assistance for the young, tax rebates for business, a higher minimum wage for labor, auto safety for drivers, pensions for the retired, fair labeling for consumers, conservation for the hikers and campers, and more and more and more. Moreover, depending on your point of view, you could expand or contract the scope of what the Great Society consisted of. So when the president was having difficulty getting the amount of money that he sought from Congress, he would call things like increase in the minimum wage, general economic growth, higher Social Security benefits, parts of the Great Society, in order to claim that a lot more money was being devoted to the Great Society than to defense. Similarly, when his critics, particularly in the Republican Party, wanted to claim that the Great Society was wasteful, they would aggregate all these things into it and say, we've spent all this money on the Great Society, and what do we have to show for it? How have we improved in this measure and that measure? So the scope was unclear, whether it referred to specific programs or to a general aspiration was unclear. And so it became, in the 60s and since, a source of contention. Now, the title of this program starts with the year 1965, but I want to suggest that key aspects of the Great Society were actually formulated during 1964, and beginning, in fact, at the Christmas holidays of 1963, when Johnson began appointing a series of task forces to come up with ideas for new agenda items, while he was involved pushing the two major initiatives of the Kennedy administration that were stuck in Congress, the tax cut and the Civil Rights Bill. But during the spring of 1964, Johnson began dropping the phrase Great Society into a series of his speeches in March and April of that year, most of which attracted little notice. But he devoted the entirety of a commencement speech at the University of Michigan in May of 1964 to elaborating on the new agenda of what he called the Great Society, which he elaborated on as related to cities, countryside, and classrooms. Now, that three-part division was almost not heard of again, but those were the initial elements that he saw as coming into the Great Society. He talked about it throughout that year. He mentioned it in his State of the Union address at the beginning of January in 1965, and in his inaugural address in late January of 65. The roots of the Great Society include Johnson's own expansive vision of what could be done, an accumulated agenda of unmet needs during the 50s and the early years of the 60s, the dominant national idealism of the early 60s, which is captured in a phrase used by John Kenneth Galbraith when he said this era was characterized by what he called dawnism, by which he meant the belief that this or that program or expenditure or initiative would mark the dawn of a new day, that it would be a transition to a different kind of national society. And then the final key root was Johnson's own immediate political situation, which is he had only 11 months before he had to run for re-election. He came into office not very well known. One poll said only 5% of the population thought that they knew him well when he came into office, compared to 24% for Kennedy. And this despite Johnson's long experience and many years in Washington. And what people did think they knew about him was not necessarily favorable to him. They didn't know much about the early roots of his career when he was a Franklin D. Roosevelt liberal. What they knew was that he had turned more conservative, as Texas had in the years after World War II. And his skill at interpersonal bargaining was widely seen by people as a defect rather than a virtue. The phrase wheeler dealer was often applied to him. And so he had to combat that perception of himself and replace it with a perception of himself that was consistent with the liberalism that was attributed to Kennedy and the idealism that was attributed to the country at the time. Now, in these speeches that I've been referring to, we can extract a kind of conceptual core to the Great Society, although it usually wasn't articulated this way. But I would emphasize four themes that came out. One was a concern for the quality, not just the quantity, of American life. In a number of these speeches, Johnson had talked about how the programs of the New Deal years had focused on growing the economy, increasing the GDP, increasing productivity, and so on. And he characterized the Great Society in contrast by saying, the Great Society asks not only how much, but how good. And he began to articulate that GDP measures social ills as well as social benefits. And it was important to focus on what would make life better in a qualitative sense. So that was one key theme. A second was a belief in the ability of the country to anticipate, shape, and direct change rather than just being reactive or passive. So he was looking down the road at problems that were going to develop and anticipating what should be done about them. And the emphasis on conservation and environmentalism was very much an example of that. This was not an item that was on the front burner of national attention by any means. And similarly with some of the other initiatives of the Johnson task forces. The third theme was concern for those who were relatively immune to the effects of macroeconomic policy. This was, in a way, the beginnings of the idea of affirmative action, that there are people left behind by the general operation of the economy, not because they're of their own failings, but because they're simply outside the ambit of the scope of economic action. That required special attention. Much of the war on poverty was directed that way to people who formed, as Johnson saw it, a kind of subculture that was just left behind by the general course of American progress, and of which most Americans were ignorant. And he said it becomes the duty of the government to see that everybody has the opportunity to compete on a level playing field. He used the metaphor of a race in one of his speeches, not race as in racial groupings, but as in running a race. And he said, you can't say that the race is fair if you take a person who's been hobbled by poverty and discrimination and cultural defects, put him at the starting gate and say, now go run the race, and think that you're running the race on fair terms. So he said it was very important to create conditions where the race could be run on fair terms. And finally, he believed that there was a role for the government as the stimulant and the guarantor of these outcomes that he saw. Now, this is not the same thing as saying the government takes over the society or the government runs all these important activities, although he was accused of that. That's not what he was saying. What he was saying is that the government had a role in sensitizing people to the problems, and that one big task of the president was agenda setting in this way, to lay national concerns before people, to arouse interest and motivation to do something about it. Now, he had two main difficulties in getting all of this stuff passed. One is that some of it was old and had been stuck in an impasse for a long time, particularly medical care and aid to education. Medical care had been stuck on the impasse of, is it socialized medicine? And aid to education had been stuck in the impasse of, do you give aid to parochial schools or just public schools? And the inability to get past these blockages had stymied efforts in these areas going back at least to the Truman administration. So what Johnson had to figure out was some way to get past those blockages. And I'll give you just one example of how he did it with aid to education. He said, let's stop talking about giving aid to public schools or to parochial schools. Let's give aid to families and to children. And so the origin of Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was drawn by analogy to impacted areas near military bases that required special attention. Children that lived in poor neighborhoods required special attention. And so the aid went to the families, not to the schools, although the schools, of course, benefited from it. The second problem was that a lot of the rest of the agenda was new. It was so new that it hadn't had a chance to bubble up in the public consciousness and attention. Good example is the war on poverty. Most people had not thought about poverty as a major national problem, and those that had didn't think much could be done about it. One Harris poll in early 1964 said something like 80 or 83% of the country subscribed to the biblical injunction, the poor ye shall always have with you, and concluded, therefore, that it was not smart to try to do something about the problem of poverty. So Johnson had to figure out how to navigate these two big problems. And some of the things that he did, he argued from a conservative perspective. These would be low-cost programs. They would save money in the end. They would, in one of the favorite phrases, make taxpayers out of tax eaters. They would be run in business-like fashion. And moreover, he emphasized that we had a moral imperative to do something, since we knew, he assumed we knew how to solve these big problems. And then finally, he tried to distinguish the Great Society programs from special measures for welfare or for race. He said these will take people off the welfare rolls, and instead of focusing on poverty and social needs in the inner cities that were predominantly Black, the early focus was on Appalachia, where poverty was predominantly white. Of course, throughout the Johnson administration, it was the case that of the poor, far more were white than black. But the concentration of poverty was in the inner city ghettos, and that undermined Johnson's goal of separating it from race and made it identified with race. So he ran into some problems. The problems were not limited to the fact that Vietnam starved the Great Society of funds, although that happened. But they also related to the fact that some of the tactical means that Johnson used to get the programs adopted in the first place created problems for them after they were implemented. And so beginning in the 60s, there was a controversy about, did the Great Society succeed or fail? You could say, well, it reduced the poverty rate, but was it the Great Society programs, or was it the general economic growth? Or was it the increase in the minimum wage or the increase in Social Security? Or were those themselves the Great Society? Ronald Reagan in 1987 said, 20 years ago, we had a war on poverty and poverty won. And by that, I think he meant that the Great Society programs did not in the long run substantially alleviate some of the problems that they were directed to. But they did make a difference in several areas. And so there's also a literature from the 80s that says the Great Society was a hidden success. And that dispute continues on to the present. And it's a version of the same dispute between the progressives arguing for major government spending under the auspices of Build Back Better, and the centrists and conservatives arguing we cannot spend our way to solve all of these problems, and we should look for other ways instead. And at that, I'll stop. I think I went a little bit over 14 minutes.
Well, thank you so much. No worries. So I will just say we are still expecting a third panelist, and if he does show up, we will give him his 12 to 14 minutes to speak, but we'll start with our questions and answers now. Now, I can come up with all sorts of my own later, but I do encourage people to put your questions into chat and question and answer. I will start immediately with a question from Harry Levinson, which was directed towards Julia Zweig, Professor Zweig. How much influence did Ladybird Johnson have on the large escalation of US involvement in Vietnam?
That's an excellent question, and I'm going to come to it, but I want to just come back to something that my colleague raised at the beginning of his talk, which has to do with March 31st, 1968. It's an incredibly important date when Johnson surprised most of the country and the world by announcing that he was not going to stand for re-election that fall. Ladybird's contribution to that statement, of course, is extremely important, but more deeply, it goes back to the spring of 1964, an absolutely seminal time in the presidency. And this I'm gonna bring Vietnam in, but just bear with me. In May of 1964, when civil rights was stuck in the Congress, before the Great Society speech in Ann Arbor, when Bob McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, comes back from his 5th trip since the assassination to Vietnam, pushing on the president to escalate, Ladybird and Lyndon are having this ongoing conversation with one another about whether Lyndon will in fact run again at all, run in the fall of 64 at all. And there's a better known incident right before the August 1964 Democratic Party convention when he's having one of his periodic freakouts and insecurity attacks. And Ladybird writes to him this beloved letter that says, of course, you should do this. And you're just as good as the presidents before, and I'll be there with you. And she famously gets him to Atlanta. But in May of where he accepts the nomination and runs, and she campaigns her heart out and they win in a landslide. But in May of 1964, he says to her, look, why don't you lay out for me the pros and cons of running or not running? And she writes to him a 9-page strategy memo, which I open my book with, which I renamed from letter, which is the way it's described at the LBJ library, to the Huntland strategy memo. It is a handwritten 9-page document in which she lays out for him, May of 64, the pros and cons of running or not running. And she gives him her conclusion, which is that he should run, that it's premature to step out of the arena for a variety of reasons, including all the good works they could possibly get done together. And then she says, but in February or March of 1968, you can tell the world that you will not be running for a second term. So there we have her, 4 years before anyone knows it, pinning the date on the donkey of the time when he's going to step down. And in fact, if you track her material beginning in around the fall of 67, she starts then pretty strategically pushing him and pushing him and pushing him to set a date. She starts drafting those speeches. She pulls out her old drafts of speeches, incorporates them into the new document that then is the one that gets read by Lyndon on May 31st, 1968. So the strategic vision and the aspect of his reliance on her and their partnership together, you're absolutely right, David. It runs across the presidency from his entrance to his exit strategy, and it runs across the administration in terms of how she was understood by his cabinet members to be so part and parcel and so necessary. If they had a problem or they needed to deal with a difficult Lyndon, Ladybird was, in a way, the shadow president. Sometimes people joked and called her Mrs. Vice President, because in 1964, remember, he didn't have a vice president. It wasn't until Humphrey was inaugurated in 65 that became the case. So I just want to reinforce with a little bit more detail what David's talking about in terms of her reach beyond the environmental components of the Great Society, which brings me to Vietnam. See, I can go long sometimes. On Vietnam, by 1964, at that moment in May of 1964, she and LBJ both understand that Vietnam could potentially be their albatross, that it could potentially get in the way of their ability to level that playing field, both economic and racial, to sort of make manifest what the Roosevelts, their idols, had started in the 1930s and 40s, what they had been young congressional spouse, and before that, even members of the Great Society, of the New Deal team when Lyndon was working in Texas. So they understood their vision of progressivism and of their potential role in it. They understood Vietnam. They understood early that Vietnam could undermine. In 1966, and I'm jumping to 66 for a minute.
Hello.
Hello. Hi. How are you?
I'm listening. I don't mean to interrupt you. I just wanted you to know that
I see you. How are you doing?
I'm well. I just wanted to make sure that you could see me and hear me. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No problem.
Okay.
It's a conversation.
Good to have you with
All right.
us.
So in 1966, at one point, she notes that 2/3 of what she and LBJ are talking about is Vietnam. That's a full year before the first major policy review on Vietnam takes place in the last quarter of 1967. It's before TED. It's critically important, though, that you understand that both Johnsons understood that they were not foreign policy mavens when they came into office. They understood the domestic, but they didn't have what they understood JFK and his team to have, which was more of a facility with foreign policy. And they were children of World War II in the sense that the idea that they would concede even to that they would betray even a weak ally in South Vietnam was hard for them to imagine. And they couldn't really see how to resist the push to escalate in Vietnam, especially because they understood that that might be the price of doing business in terms of achieving their domestic objectives. So she shared LBJ's, the conundrum that he experienced. She felt the pain that, and she uses that word, that LBJ experienced on Vietnam as far as losing children first the children of other Americans to that war, and later, and this was an important turning point, and we think of her children's spouses as potentially coddled and sheltered from actual danger. But by late 67, early 68, when her attitudes shift toward Vietnam, I mean, by then the country's protest movement is massive. In part, that's because her own daughters are marrying or engaged to men that are going to be going to Vietnam. And that brings the war home for her in a way that all of the protests outside of the White House, all of the protests on college campuses that she was running into hadn't. It really, I think, in my reading of it, is Linda and Lucy's spouses, because at that moment, and again, late 67, early 68, Linda Johnson Robb, begins to bring wounded veterans into the White House for private meetings. And Ladybird is confronted with literally something as tangible as, how do you shake hands with somebody that's lost their arms when they're coming to greet you? So this is a long way of saying that she understood how foreboding and potentially damaging the war was or could be. She understood it early on. And she felt great empathy for her husband's pain around it. But it wasn't until the end of 67, early 68, that she, I think, definitively shifted to seeing Vietnam as the more than the albatross, the cause of so many failures of great society programs they would have liked to see advance.
Thank you very much. I'm going to say, Professor Woods, we've had two speeches and then just one answer to a question that was in particular about Ladybird and Vietnam. May I ask if you'd be so kind as to give your 12 to 14 minute talk now, and then we can get back to the Q&A.
So we're just warming up?
No. This we started at 2 p.m. Sorry, there may have been a time zone confusion.
There was, yes, indeed. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so anyway, yes, yeah.
I wrote about the Great Society and its origins. It was an unprecedented reform movement in American history. More than 1,000 pieces of legislation. It was unlike the progressivism and populism and the New Deal, Fair Deal. It highlighted racial justice more than anything else. The 1964 Equal Accommodations Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, obviously were civil rights measures, but so were Medicare and Medicaid, which prohibited discrimination. So was federal aid education, which prohibited discrimination. But it went beyond that. You have the first clean air, clean water legislation in American history. The Immigration Act of 1965 did away with the national quota system and led to a much more ethnically and racially blind admissions policy. You had federal aid, the first federal aid to to public television and public radio. It was sweeping in its effects. The engines which drove it were, I think, first the civil rights movement, which during the 1950s became a mass movement because of the participation of Black churches and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Before that, it was primarily an effort by Black and white elites. The Sputnik crisis, the crisis of confidence that the nation experienced after that, fueled it. the advent of the New Left, called Huron Statement in 1962, you have increasing student awareness in a nation that's increasingly young, denouncing the military-industrial complex, pressing for racial and social justice. That drove it. Kennedy's idealism, which appealed to the greatest generation, energized the greatest generation. And then LBJ himself, a man who had something of a messiah complex and was driven indeed to exceed his hero, Franklin Roosevelt. The measures that only Johnson could have gotten those measures through Congress because of his, not only because of his political acumen and experience, but also because he was a Southerner. And the South was only going to take the 63 and 64 Civil Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act from a Southerner, something that Jack Kennedy could never have done. As you know, Johnson never thought he would be president. He felt that the Kennedys were going to drop him from the ticket. But in those first days, obviously, as he filled those yellow notepads, he'd been dreaming dreams of creating a more just and equitable society. He told Bill Noyers that the administration probably had 22 months, a 22-month window to get that legislation passed. The conservative coalition, which consisted of conservative Democrats and Republicans, had been blocking progressive legislation since the Truman administration. There was Vietnam looming on the horizon. Johnson believed that he had only so much political capital to spend. Now, in some cases, the Great Society contained the seeds of its own destruction. For example, a community action program, which encouraged poor and disadvantaged to farm and submit plans to the Office of Economic Opportunity, alienated mayors, city leaders who believed that the federal government was allowing itself to the poor to circumvent their power. Johnson told the nation that the Great Society would take people off of welfare, would turn tax eaters into tax payers. But part of the war on poverty produced the National Welfare Rights Organization, which had as its goal getting as many people on the welfare rolls as possible in order to break the system. The New Left was turned on Johnson and the Great Society because they believed it wasn't radical enough. It wasn't extreme enough in promoting participatory democracy and spending enough money. The conservatives, of course, mounted an attack on the Great Society while it was actually being born. And what played into their hands was not only Vietnam, but was the urban rioting that began with Watts and culminated perhaps with Detroit in 1967. Both Johnson and Martin Luther King were Southerners. They did not understand the plight of Northern Blacks who suffered not from so much from institutionalized discrimination, but from insurance policies, city ordinances, lack of transportation. And so the rioting that swept the country, beginning with Watts, not only stupefied King and Johnson, but played into the hands of their conservative opponents. By the end of the Johnson administration, the conservative war cry was the war on crime. And they blamed the war on poverty for the urban rioting, ironically. They argued that the more the federal government did to aid the disadvantaged, the more they created dependency and entitlement. The more the federal government condoned civil rights protests, the more they encouraged looting and rioting, which of course was a non sequitur. But the Great Society was sweeping in its scope. It has, if you look at the past 50 years, if you look at the years since the Reagan administration, there has been a concerted effort by the conservatives to dismantle the major pieces of legislation passed during the Johnson administration.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And so we have now heard all three of our speakers give their talks. I will ask people to put in more questions. Now, I know there's at least one, but I suppose I want to ask one which is sort of following up on that previous Ladybird question, which is, I guess, whose is the Great Society? That is, one does hear, overwhelmingly about LBJ, but it is presumably, it's also Ladybirds, it's also members of the, high members of the White House, their priorities, mid-level staffers. It is congressmen and their supporters as well. And of course, the whole general climate of opinion, how much of this is stuff finally being done, which was, 130 years ago. But in fact, how much is the Great Society a cooperative effort? How much is it LBJ, working with, let's say at the minimum, the executive and the legislative branch people he has to cooperate with? How much is it shifted from his vision because he has all these other people he's working with?
Well,
for all of you.
I don't think that, I mean, he didn't, he compromised on very few things. He made compromises when he had to, but he knew Congress. He knew that he had to have Republican support, and he was able to get Republican support. Remember, he asked Gabriel Dirksen, "Are you the party of Lincoln, or are you not the party of Lincoln?" He had contacts with organized labor. He had contacts with business. He had contacts with with traditional the traditional interest groups that affected American politics in the first half of the 20th century. What he didn't understand was the new environmentalism. He didn't understand the youth movement. He wasn't, although he was very progressive in his views on women, he wasn't aware of the shift that was taking place, where progressives would increasingly focus on causes and not on specific policies. In fact, that caused him problems in the latter part of his administration.
Absolutely, and I would say, let me jump in here. Both of the Johnsons thought of themselves as progressives, and they were sort of dumbfounded by their gradual alienation from the center of what was considered progressive over the course of the decade.
Right.
They had a very sophisticated and layered political strategy of big tent coalition politics. And so, trade, business, unions, agriculture, church groups, civil rights groups, the press, the media, they were traditional in terms of building political coalitions and harnessing social movement energy in the civil rights movement to get their legislation passed. The inside-outside strategy has been told and retold, but can't be stressed enough how strategic LBJ was and Martin Luther King was around 64 and 65 civil rights. But they were kind of dumbfounded, as I said, at how larger social forces and social movements just overshadowed what their objectives were, and they saw themselves. I mean, by the time they stated, and I'm saying they, Professor Woods, because we made a point of talking about Ladybirds involvement in the strategy of
absolutely.
his stepping down in March of '68 and a number of other parts of his presidency. But by the time they decided to leave Washington, the country had really begun to pass them by, and they were happy to get back to the ranch, I would say.
Yeah, I think both in domestic and in foreign affairs, it's fair to say that Johnson was a quintessential 1940s and 50s liberal, a Cold War liberal, and it was his fate to be that at just the time that the country is starting to change away from that set of assumptions and pass him by. But to your question, David, I don't think Johnson is a mouthpiece for anybody. He's articulating his own deeply felt convictions in calling for the Great Society, and he's using his techniques of consensus building to find allies for most of these ventures. I think the Great Society as a phrase originated with his speechwriters who just started dropping it into speeches in the spring of '64, and the media noticed and picked it up. And then Johnson picked up the phrase to emphasize in the University of Michigan commencement speech, and then it took off from there.
I think that's right. That term, the Great Society, was named after a Graham Wallace book. They first thought about using a phrase that Walter Lippmann had used. I think it was the Good Society, but they settled on the Great Society. Sort of, I don't know who came up with that, Moyers or one of his advisors.
I think it was a good one. Or who knows, they all claim it.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's not clear that they actually consulted that book. It may be a pure coincidence.
No, I don't think they did. No, it had nothing. It had nothing to do. I think I read the book, and it had to do. The term "great" in that book meant large. It was a critique of industrial society, so it didn't have anything substantially to do with the Great Society.
I should say, by the way, I didn't mean to say Lyndon Johnson is a mouthpiece. This is just, I suppose, abstract revisionism. X is associated with one great person. Therefore, revisionists will say, no, it is a host of smaller people as well, which was, I think, what I was trying for.
Okay, well, that's certainly true.
Johnson had that thing. He had this sense of premonition. His son-in-law said he was like a spider in the middle of a huge spider web, and he knew whenever one of those pieces of web was vibrating or plucked. He told, I think, Valenti, I can't remember, but he said, we're going to turn, and this is the midst of the Great Society, we're going to turn the South over to the Republican Party for the foreseeable future.
That was after the Civil Rights Act passed,
right.
and it was Moyers.
It was Moyers.
Moyers, yeah.
And he was right.
Yeah, he was right, but he said it's worth it.
Yeah.
What was remarkable when he was campaigning for the Equal Accommodations Act, he made that tour through the South and went through Georgia and down in Louisiana, and the crowds, these are Southerners, white and black, and the crowds were unprecedented in their size. He sensed something, perhaps an opportunity here to actually realize the dream of the New South. It faded, but it was there. I read those newspaper accounts. They were sort of amazing.
I want to take a question, if I may, from Rade Radovich and perhaps push it a little bit. His question is, did moderate and liberal Republicans support the Great Society legislation? And I think I want to push or twist that. Did the middle of the country initially support the Great Society legislation and then change its mind? Or was it always, in effect, a policy of a left plurality, a left minority, pushed against the hesitations of the middle, who then simply, expressed, we always were, ambivalent about this. And I guess I would say, added to that, what parts of the Great Society legislation did the middle of the country support the most and the least?
Well, they supported civil rights the least. They didn't, you can't talk about, we talk about the Great Society, but all of these bills had different constituencies, and they played in different ways among
Right.
religious groups, economic groups, and some supported some programs and fought bitterly against others. And Johnson understood that, and he told his advisors that the pieces of legislation that were passed in 1965 had to be passed in a certain order, because for example, the Voting Rights Act had to do with race. Well, the Education Act had to do with religion, public schools and private schools, and then Social Security appeal to different groups of people. So Social Security was going to appeal to poor whites, who would be opposed to, many of whom would be opposed to the Voting Rights Act. So there was a certain order that they had to be passed so that you could put the pieces of the puzzle together for each specific piece of legislation.
I think it's also true that a number of the pieces of legislation were not the results of public pressure. There
That's
was
right.
no public groundswell for the war on poverty, for example.
That's right.
They were created top down, not bottom up. And so what Johnson did in many cases was he got acquiescence rather than overwhelming approval from the middle of the country. And then when things went sour, he started losing that.
I think that's right. I think acquiescence is really a key term to use when looking at the Great Society. And he persuaded the South to acquiesce in the passage of the Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 65, and not do what they did after Brown, not call for massive resistance. There's that his patron and his adversary, Richard Russell, their dialogue is so revealing in that regard.
I have a question about that then. So we know that Lyndon Johnson was a master of legislation. Had he thought out how to sell the program to the country at large beyond the legislature sufficiently well? I mean, was it a well thought, well-conceived plan to sell it to the public, or were there shortfalls in how that was done?
Well, this was
Well,
not
of
his
course
main
there-
focus.
Excuse Both of you, please. But I mean, Professor Zarefsky first, then Professor Zweig.
I mean, he pretty much defined the passage of legislation as his measure of success. Now, it's not that he didn't think about how to sell to the country. It's not that he didn't think about administrative details, but that's not where his mind and heart were. And so he didn't give them enough attention, in my opinion.
Professor Zweig?
When you say, I have to ask, which of the them are you talking about that he didn't give enough attention? Because my take is that, at the end of 1964, once he decided he's going to run for sure, he thinks he's got a very limited period of time, right? That his political capital is declining by the month, and that he has to shove through as much legislation as possible early, not just because Vietnam is going to gobble up dollars and political and public relations capital, but because he understands the dynamic that, just more is more at the front end of any presidency, and all of those task forces at the beginning and all of the outreach that he was doing to the media and the constant convening of different constituents and stakeholders, to my mind, is 100% about selling his legislative packages and bolstering and pressuring Congress to enact the legislation that he's putting forward in 65, 66.
But he was not as concerned with what happened to it after it was enacted.
No, that's right. His relationship with the press was a disaster. He treated them like the press in Texas, where you courted the editor and got their support, and you promised them certain things. He wanted to bargain with the media, which of course totally alienated the Washington and New York press, because they were ready to support him. Most of the then it was true that most of the press was progressive and liberal, but he had this. He didn't believe in objective reporting. He didn't think there was any such thing as objective reporting. He thought everybody, every publication had an axe to grind, ideological or economic. So his selling of the I don't think he gets high marks for marketing his product, for selling his product. And as Professor Zaleski said, he didn't really care. After it was passed, he turned to something else. He moved on. So I don't think he gets high marks. And indeed, the success of the Great Society, the passage of all those measures, is not due to a huge groundswell of public opinion. Jack Kennedy won over Richard Nixon by what, 1/10%. The country was divided ideologically. So it's almost what he's doing is almost political mathematics, political calculus here.
Thank you. I have there's a question here about, actually there's a whole bunch of questions which are in effect about, the critique of the Great Society, and that, this is being, Thomas Sowell's critique of the Great Society, in effect, a response to, Professor Wood's, that, was it not indeed, a source of such, various radical rebellions later on. I guess I would connect that to, in effect, you were saying that there was a sort of a pre-existing critique of the Great Society, more or less from, before it was even passed. But how should I put, let me then say, when can we say that enough of the Great Society has actually happened, that there is an effective critique of what it has done, 1967, 1970, and what are the most salient, the most persuasive critiques of the Great Society in your different opinions?
Well, I'll take an extreme position. I don't think there was ever a point where it was fully enough implemented that it was possible to have a serious, sustained critique that got to the question of what it has done. Most of the programs never got beyond the pilot level. And Johnson sometimes dissembled about this. So he said, for example, that the funding for the war on poverty was doubled from the first year to the second year, which was true, but the first year's appropriation covered only half the year because it was passed midway in the year. So it was static. And he played games like that. And as I said in my talk, this was partly because Vietnam starved the funds, but it was also because political problems developed as the implementation was taking place. And so the critiques were things like Professor Wood's statement, you've put the community action program in the hands of people who are challenging the mayors. Well, the mayors didn't like it. And Johnson was beholden to the mayors, so he sent Humphrey to work out a deal. Now, that's a kind of critique of the program, and it suggests it was probably misguided to conceive of community action in the way that it was done, although community action was not without positive results too. There was the critique that said the Great Society is raising expectations that can't be met, and that was the link that was then developed to the riots. When expectations can't get met, people get frustrated, and when they get frustrated, they riot. And this was particularly the argument that was made by Gerald Ford, who was then the minority leader in the House of Representatives. So there are politically based critiques. There are also critiques of the whole idea of using government in the fashion that Johnson proposed to use it, that are abstract arguments about political theory. But in terms of the operation of the programs, most of the self-styled Great Society programs never really got off the ground. The ones that did were things like Medicare and aid to education that became accepted as parts of the political landscape.
I agree with you. And those were built on sort of. There was already a foundation for those things, and these were layered on top of something that was already there, and so not considered as radical as community action. So I don't. Of course, I'm an historian. I don't know about anything that happened after 1975, so it's hard for me. It's hard for me to talk about critiques. I know my understanding is that during the Reagan administration, you have the beginning of an effort to critique the Great Society, perhaps not critique, but to offer an alternative, to it. But it's still amazing to me how even among conservatives, the term that when they want to talk about liberalism, they still talk about the New Deal fair deal. If you statistically, if you look at the conservative columnists, the term Great Society simply doesn't appear. Now they attack specific policies, specific components, but not the overall concept. And as my colleagues have indicated, I'm not sure there was an overall concept. There was this cartoon when Theodore Roosevelt was at his most progressive, and it depicted him as embracing all the latest reforms. There was no coherence to his program, but whatever the newest reform was, he wanted to get on board with it. There's a little of that in Johnson, I think.
Unfortunately, I'm going to have to jump a little bit early. I've got something to attend to in the house. This is the downside of Zooming from home, gentlemen. But I would say that I think in the rear view mirror, to reinforce what Professor Woods just said, that the Great Society as a term might not be bandied about so much, but certainly it when we talk about the role of government and putting money into things, that is the big idea that the Great Society is associated with and criticized for. I mean, in its aftermath, in the last 40, 50 years, what we've seen is a concerted conservative critique and attack on spending big dollars for big social programs. And that is very much about this liberal agenda of the decade of the 1960s that these people who thought of themselves as very progressives thought they were trying to implement by leveling the economic and racial playing field with, small as they may be, still very significant programs that some of which still reshape the fabric of this society today. So I think the term itself is less important than the idea, both supported or critiqued by conservatives and some also very much by progressives today, for being too little or too much, that the federal government has a role in shaping the social contract of the country.
The term Great Society hasn't been used, because it has not been. It has not been visible, not only because of conservative critiques, from, for example, the Kennedy heritage, the Kennedy family, the Kennedy mystique, which is still very powerful, will not. They have worked to diminish the visibility of the Great Society and Lyndon Johnson because they still believe, a la Bobby Kennedy, that Johnson was a usurper, that all of the major ideas behind the Great Society were really great frontier ideas. There's some within the civil rights community who believe that to glorify Johnson, to privilege Johnson, is to diminish Martin Luther King. You saw that in Selma, the movie Selma, in which Johnson barely gets a nod. There's a number of factors that have come together to, I think.
Then the elephant in the room is Vietnam.
Well, of course, and Vietnam, of course, absolutely, the most important.
Everybody, I've spoken on Vietnam, so I'm going to leave the elephant to you. I'm so terribly sorry, but I have to jump and take care of something. Wonderful to be with all of you.
Good
And
to
thank
see
you so much for coming. We're
Good to
very
have you
grateful.
with us.
Bye.
Thank
Be
you.
well. Thank you.
I'm going to I'm going to say one thing, and then which I might ask if you come back to, but I just want to actually get to a question from the audience. And in fact, I would say on critiques, I would distinguish between, I'm going to call it conservative and neoconservative critiques, where in effect the conservative critique is this should not be done at all, whereas the neoconservative critique, which I gather take as to be essentially a response to the Great Society, is maybe this is a good thing to be done, but it's just not working. And that, in effect, one of the results of the Great Society, the birth of the neoconservative movement, not initially in response to foreign policy, but domestic policy. Having said that, and I know that's going to want responses, I just also want to add a question from the audience, from Jessica Galloway Good. How should we judge the results, especially economically, of the Immigration Act of 1965? While correlation isn't causation, Black male workers were closing the wage gap on white male workers significantly in the years leading up to 1965, but began losing ground by 1973. I want to jump to that because this is, in fact, it is a major result of the Great Society package of legislation. It wasn't, I think, taken as such at the time. It wasn't, I think, part of the initial debates. And it's not even part of, I think, I don't have the sense that even in the historiography, people think of it as a central component of the Great Society, but it started then and obviously has had a great effect on the country. So what is your sense of the evaluation of it, of its effects?
I don't buy into the assumption that lies behind the question.
Which is?
I don't think the Great Society programs have had that effect. I do not think the Immigration Act has had that effect. I don't think it's damaged the country economically. I don't think it's eroded the middle class. I just don't accept that.
The Immigration Act. The Immigration Act is a major example of unanticipated consequences. I don't think that when it was being debated and passed, anybody imagined that it would produce such a dramatic increase in immigration or such a dramatic shift in where the immigration came from. But it was an attempt to get rid of a national origin system that not only limited immigration, but was based on racist assumptions about who were good immigrants.
That's correct. You're absolutely right.
Well, I will say, actually, I know there's a fair bit of stuff on this, which the Jessica Good style question has a certain amount of information to substantiate the argument, but I don't want to get into those weeds too much. Maybe if I could get back to that whole neoconservative thing, which I did sort of pop at you. Well, may I go back to that then? Is this not then one of the great results of the Great Society, the birth of a neoconservative movement, which is critiquing not the ends, but the means of the Great Society? I put this to you.
Well, I'm not sure that there's one understanding of neoconservatism, but as I understand it, it's an emphasis on market-based incentives. to achieve desirable social results. And that was part of the early critique of the Nixon administration in its early years, before it became more of a far-right administration. But in the early years, the attempt was to not get rid of the Office of Economic Opportunity, for example, but to reorient it and make it more successful by focusing on markets. And I think that was a dominant trend in the 1970s that was participated in not only by Republican critics, but by many Democrats. To some extent, Carter was of that mind, and some of the people working with and advising Carter. So I think you're right in saying that that's a different line of argument from the line of argument that says this is an unworthy objective or it shouldn't be pursued by government.
Professor Woods?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that I'm more aware of neoconservatism as a foreign policy phenomena than I am as a domestic phenomena. But yeah, my understanding is that it is about me. The criticism is about how to do things. But you can how to achieve social and economic justice without further enlarging the federal government, without intruding into family life. You remember the Moynihan Report and the Black family and the controversy that spurred. The logic of that was sort of Orwellian. You take the child away from the family, and I think that was the book I wrote in its title was The Limits of Liberalism, and what you see in 1968 and 1967 is the architects of the Great Society themselves began to realize that there were limits on what they could do, and that some of the things they were doing were counterproductive.
Right.
What did they think was the most counterproductive things they were doing?
Well, Johnson turned against the Community Action Program, of course, in his Howard speech, he first articulated the concept of affirmative action, but he and George Reedy, his advisor on this, took a very they didn't anticipate it that it would evolve into a demand for quotas, representation of local populations. They were talking about fairness and evenness in hiring. So I think they thought that was counterproductive. Johnson became extremely disillusioned as he was getting hammered over Vietnam, and as he was getting hammered over rioting in the city. As I said, he and King were Southerners. He did not understand the Great Migration. He didn't understand the problems that urban blacks faced in the North, cities of the North and the Midwest. And he verbally, at least, turned on some of his programs, turned against the war on poverty. But that was more a kind of visceral reaction than I think a philosophical one.
Well, so how much is the Great Society really a Southern development program in disguise?
Well, which I wouldn't say that about clean air and clean water. I wouldn't say that about the Immigration Act. I wouldn't say that in its economic aspect. Perhaps, yes, it is. Yes, it was. In the war on poverty, absolutely. The Southern Development Program.
You could say that much of the domestic policy since World War II was a Southern Development Program.
Yeah. Yep.
The thing that the Great Society contributed, and I think you mentioned this in the beginning of your talk, Professor Woods, was that Southern development could not ignore the reality of racial difference, and it needed to do something to correct it.
That's right.
I have another question then to extend. We think of the Great Society as, it's the expansion of the federal government. but how much does it inspire the re-envisioning of state governments, of local governments, indeed of civil society? I mean, how much do the aspirations of the Great Society then get translated into the growth of these, bureaucracies and all these different levels of American state, government and society?
Well, I mean, the civil rights movement the civil rights components of the Great Society are a statement by progressives that local and state governments cannot be trusted. They cannot be trusted to bring the dream of the Declaration of Independence into reality. If left to themselves, they're going to continue to discriminate in the South. Again, that was true of the North as well. But the Great Society, the architects never really had a plan for how to bring social and economic justice to the ghettos of the North and the Midwest.
Professor Zarefsky?
I think the honest but simple answer to your question is it varied. There were some cases where the Great Society programs were antagonistic to state and local government and to civil society initiatives. And there were some cases where they created incentives that were picked up, particularly with the federal grant funds that went to local organizations or to states for particular purposes. Some were more enthusiastic about going along, and some were more resistant to going along. So I think it had obviously some impact, but it's pretty hard to say exactly what or how much.
Yeah, I think that's for the next generation of scholars to look, and they're beginning to do that. The young scholars are going into communities in New Orleans and Philadelphia, and right now they're focusing on cities because they're easier to study. But eventually, I think scholars will turn, as they did with the New Deal, turn to rural areas as well.
Well, indeed, then actually, so let's talk about the scholarship. How has the scholarship of the Great Society changed, in the generations? And I guess particularly, what is the latest generation of scholars of the Great Society focusing on?
These local stuff. Well, it depends on civil rights people are focusing on the '64 Civil Rights Act, but there's I don't know of anyone who's really the work I did. My book on Prisoners of Hope was a beginning, was a kind of survey of the of the Great Society and its origins and what we know about it. But now you're seeing these people that are answering the question that you asked earlier. What impact did the Great Society and its various components have on specific communities? And that's what they're working on now. That's what happened with the New Deal, scholarship in the New Deal, and not progressivism because it wasn't really policy oriented, but the New Deal and trade deal.
This is an overgeneralization, but I think recent scholarship has been less ideologically divisive, and so that it's been less concerned with fighting the war over was the Great Society a good thing or a bad thing.
That's right.
And focusing more on empirical results.
That's right. It's sort of like in Vietnam, scholarship on Vietnam, I like to call post-rapprochement after the Ken Burns film, which was all about reconciliation. I mean, post-reconciliation scholarship. It's more about whether we were wrong or right or evil or good. It's more about what happened and circumstance and so forth. And I think that's true of the Great Society scholarship as well.
Nifty, thank you. I am going to say we're approaching 3:30. I'm therefore going to ask, might I ask for a sort of a closing statement of perhaps a minute from each of you? Professor Woods first, then Professor Zarefsky.
Well, I'm very grateful that your organization decided to do this. I think that I think that the Great Society is a phenomena worth studying in itself, but it also is incredibly educational for people who are trying to deal with current issues of race and religion and economics and region. I'm grateful that you put the spotlight on what I think is the most significant phenomenon.
Thank you.
I would underscore Professor Wood's statement that the controversies of the Great Society years have taken different permutations, but they're basically still with us, as I tried to suggest in the conclusion of my comments. The other thing I would say is, despite the attention that we've tried to shed on these things in this discussion and in other discussions and in current scholarship, Johnson is an unusual case. Most presidents find that their approval rating goes up in the years after they left office, and particularly in the years after they died. Johnson is something of an exception. He remains stuck in about the place that he was when he left office. And I think that's the result, very simply, of the eclipse of all of what we've talked about today by the reality of Vietnam and the great failure that, in retrospect, Vietnam has come to seem.
Thank you so much. All right. Thank you both very much. Thanks also to Professor Zweig, who had to leave early, alas. So thank you all for making a wonderful and stimulating conversation. Thank you to our audience for all your questions, which make it possible. I am going to say once again, if your questions weren't answered and you want to answer, please send them to me, randall@nas.org. I will forward them to our participants so they can have the option to respond. And again, you will be able to hear this again within 24 hours on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel. I will just do a brief plug for our future works. We have a bunch of webinar series. We're continuing with our Great American History webinar series, and I believe the next one is April 12th on the fall of communism. We have a Great American Literature series. I believe the next one is April 5th, Call of the Wild. And I will even say we've got a special one on, and this is going to be fun, UFOs and their implications for international relations. That's coming up in, I think, just 2 days. We're trying to take a fun topic and give it a serious academic spin. UFOs spin well, you understand. So, but that's the commerce, the publicity for everything else we're doing. Let me just close again by saying, professors, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your conversation. It has been wonderful. I'm very grateful to all three of you, present and absent.
Thank you.
Thank you.